Hi, and welcome back to Lux Consumer IQ. If this is your first time here, I'm really glad you found us. And if you've been with me all season, today is for you. This is the season 1 finale, and I've been looking forward to this one for a while because it's where everything we've built this season finally lands in one place. So I want to start with a question, and I'm directing this especially to our marketers out there. Have you ever been in this situation? You've done the work, you've commissioned research or pulled the data or even completed the analysis yourself. You've been living and breathing your consumers' world, their lives, their motivations, what they desire and what holds them back. You understand the market, you know where the brand sits in people's minds, and you know what needs to change. Brand planning season arrives, you're pumped. You present your plan that you have been poring over for weeks or months. It looks solid. It's professional. You've covered all bases. And somehow, despite everything you know, the plan that gets approved looks a lot like the plan from last year. The budget conversation goes the same way. The strategic direction was already decided before you even walked in. And you're left wondering, what was the point of all that work? If that sounds familiar, you're not imagining it, and it's not a gap in your capability. It's a gap in something nobody explicitly teaches you. How to make insight show up inside the plan in a way that actually changes decisions. How to turn what you know about the consumer, about the market, into the story that shapes what the organization does next. That's what today's episode is about. Essentially, this is about storytelling, using real evidence about your consumer and your market to shape the story that drives decisions. What often takes years to learn on the job through a lot of trial and error, we're going to unpack it here together over the next 20 minutes. By the end of this episode, you're going to understand exactly where insight is supposed to live inside your marketing plan, the 6 places it needs to show up and what it's there to do in each one. And I'm going to show you in just a couple of minutes how you can quickly check whether you are being strategic and are using real insight to shape your plans, or whether you are just being, very busy. It's often the question I was asked the most by the marketing team when I was in-house leading the insights functions. Let me take a moment to share where this perspective is coming from, because the lens I'm bringing today is quite specific. I've spent over 20 years working across marketing and insights. A decade of that was inside LVMH, the world's largest luxury group, working both in market and at headquarters in Paris, partnering with teams around the world to turn intelligence into real competitive advantage. And in fact, a large part of my insights career as an ex-marketer has actually been in transformation roles, helping organizations become genuinely consumer-centric and helping marketers to use data and insight more strategically so they can make better decisions and grow their brands. That's the end goal. So I get it, because I actually started my own career on the marketing side before moving into insights. So I've sat on both sides of the table. So here's the first thing I want you to hear today. If your insight isn't landing in the plan the way that you want it to, that is almost never about the quality of the research. The research might be excellent, and even the insight might be genuinely sharp. The issue, and this is the thing that nobody tells you, is usually structural. Most formal training teaches marketers how to run research and even how to find the insights. Very few programs teach you what to do with them once you have them and you're in charge of managing a brand. How to make them stick inside a plan in a way that changes what actually gets decided. There's a moment between knowing something important about your consumer and actually letting that change a decision. A gap between the insight being found and the insight doing its job. I call it the gap between insight and action. And the most reliable place to close that gap, the one document where insights either earn their place or disappear, is the annual marketing plan. Now, I want to be precise about what I mean by the marketing plan. Whatever the name you use inside your organization, this process is essentially the document with the marketing strategy. It's where your organization makes its intentions official. It's where priorities are set, budgets allocated, objectives agreed. Trade-offs are made explicit and success is defined before anything is launched. It is also the moment where the strategy meets execution, the moment where you are directly influencing senior leadership, presenting your vision, your choices, your evidence, and they will either be on board or they won't. That moment has leverage that nothing else does. If insight shapes those decisions, you have a plan that is genuinely grounded in evidence. Leadership can follow the trail. They can see why each choice was made. If it doesn't, the insight got commissioned, but it didn't make it into the decisions. You have a well-intentioned plan that looks like strategy, but functions like a to-do list. And I want to be clear. Most teams are working incredibly hard. The work is real. The gap isn't effort. It's architecture. The plan is not where you present research. It's where you apply it. It's where your knowledge of the consumer becomes the story that shapes what the business does next. And that is actually the thread running through everything we've explored together in season 1. We've opened with the idea that data is credibility, the currency that gets good ideas taken seriously inside organizations. I shared the LCIQ Insights Framework, the thinking behind how to move from inputs to meaning to a genuine point of view, not just a finding. And we talked about brand health tracking as strategic infrastructure, not reporting. And through our guest conversations, we heard directly from luxury insiders about how the most respected brands think about their consumers and what separates the ones who adapt from the ones who don't. Each of those builds to this moment because the question that sits underneath all of it is, where does it actually go? Where does the insight land in a way that changes something that matters? The answer is inside the marketing plan. So let me show you the architecture. So what does an insight-led marketing plan actually look like? We won't go into the detail of how to build each section today. That's way too much, and that's a much deeper conversation. Instead, we will stay at a top level and look at what is the structure and what is each element there to do. So let's begin. There are 6 elements, and in a genuinely insights-led plan, each one has a specific job. So let's take a look at each of them. The first one is context, and this is where most plans begin, and honestly, where many plans already have data. So this isn't usually the problem section, but there's an important difference between a context section that summarizes data and one that frames reality. So let me give you an example. A data summary says, here are the market numbers, here are the trends. Reality framing says, here is what is actually true about our consumer and our market right now that matters for the decisions we're about to make. The difference is selection. You're not showing everything. You're choosing what matters for this plan this year, these specific decisions. When insight shapes context, it creates alignment. Everyone in the room is working off the same version of reality. And in my personal experience, that is considerably rarer than it sounds. Teams spend weeks collecting category data, consumer insight, market trends, all valuable pieces of context. And I've been there myself, trying to squeeze every fact I want leadership to know about my market onto the context page. You probably know exactly what I'm talking about, but at some point, someone has to step back and ask a very simple question. What is the one thing leadership actually needs to understand to make the right decision this year? Because context without selection often becomes a lot of information. And here's where it gets interesting, because this next section is the one most plans either skip entirely or get wrong, and it's the one that does most of the structural work. It's the problem statement, or the key business question. Its job is to translate all of that context into focus. It answers one question. Of everything we could do, what is the specific challenge we are solving for, and why does it matter to the business right now? Not 10 things, 1, maybe 2. Precise, consequential, named in a way that makes the stakes visible. When insight shapes the problem statement, something really valuable happens. It creates permission to say no. to the activity requests, the bright ideas, the things that are interesting but don't serve this problem. Focus isn't a personality trait. It's a structural decision, and it starts right here. One thing I've noticed over the years is that strategy often gets diluted when the core question hasn't clearly been defined. You'll hear broad objectives like build awareness or increase consideration, but those words can mean very different things depending on who is in the room. Are we talking about top of mind awareness, familiarity with the brand, understanding of the product range, and importantly, by how much? Because once the question is precise, the metrics become obvious, and that's when a plan starts to become truly strategic. Okay, let's move on. From focus, you move to intent. This is the objective section, where insight shifts from what we learned to what we're committing to achieve. Strong plans separate brand objectives from commercial objectives, and this is important, not because one matters more, but because they work on completely different timescales. Brand metrics is things like preference, consideration, emotional connection. These are all slow, often 12 to 18 months before you see some meaningful movement, if in fact you're trying to move the dial. Commercial metrics move in weeks, perhaps even days. Knowing that difference changes how you set expectations, how you report progress, and how you protect the long-term work, which is super critical in the luxury space. When insight shapes objectives, they become specific enough to defend. Not vague aspirations, but precise commitments traceable back to what you actually know about the market. Okay, let's move on to my favorite, measurement. Metrics sometimes, unfortunately, get chosen way too often because they're easy to report, not because they prove that the strategy is working. Insight-led measurement does two specific things. It maps every metric back to a specific objective, and this is really important. It sets a baseline, a target, and a time frame before the year begins, not after. And now we get to the section that I think makes the single biggest difference, and the one that is most often missing: strategic choices. Strategic choices are exactly what the name suggests. Choices. This is where a plan becomes a set of bets rather than a list of activities. And in luxury especially, that discipline matters because the strongest luxury brands are built through deliberate selectivity, not chasing everything, but protecting the choices that reinforce desirability, rarity, and long-term brand meaning. Now, in my experience, this rarely exists as a formal written section in a plan document. What it actually is more often is a moment in that room, in that meeting. The moment in the strategic presentation where someone says, this year we are focused on this. We are not chasing that. Once we've addressed the awareness gap, we'll shift weight to conversion, for example. That clarity, even when it isn't formalized on a page, is what gives leadership confidence to approve the direction. Because when the trade-offs are visible, leadership can engage with the thinking. They're not just approving a list, they're approving a strategy. And here is the insider advice I want to give you on this one. When you walk into that room, you should be able to clearly and confidently articulate what you are not doing this year and why. Not apologetically, not as a footnote, as a deliberate, evidence-based choice. Because anyone can present a full activity plan. It's what we do best as marketers. What proves to leadership that you didn't miss anything, that you looked at the full picture, weighed the evidence, and made a deliberate call is the ability to say, we considered this, we understood its value, and we are choosing not to pursue it this year. Here is what we are doing instead. And here is why that is the right call right now. You might even flag one item specifically for next year that signals not just strategic clarity for this cycle, but forward thinking. You're already managing the roadmap, not just this year's plan. That is the behavior of someone leadership trusts to run the brand. And what is the opposite of this? It goes something like this. A plan that will grow awareness and drive conversion and expand into a new market and strengthen retail and build community. 5 priorities, which is often another way of saying there is no real priority. The teams that tend to earn the most organizational confidence are the ones who come in and say, this year, We are doing this one thing exceptionally well. And here is what we are choosing not to do and why. The most successful organizations I personally have worked in tend to call them something like big bets, something along those lines, depending on the organization. This step is super important. Do not underestimate it, especially when budgets are getting tight. Okay, so this brings us to the beloved activations section of the plan. Here we're talking about campaigns, channels, content, experiences. This is where the energy is at. It's what we see, it's what gets celebrated, and rightly so. Luxury teams genuinely excel here. But in an insight-led plan, activations come at the end of the planning process because it is where strategy becomes visible. It's the expression of everything that came before it. Activation designed without strategic context produces beautiful work that may generate press, earn applause, and delight the team, but that may or may not move the business or the brand forward in a way that it needs to right now. Activation designed within strategic context produces work with a job to do. And work with a job to do is considerably easier to defend, to fund, and to measure. Let me give you an example of missed opportunity here. I've said in brand reviews where a flagship brand event, extraordinary production, exceptional press, genuinely moving, was positioned as brand building, and it was. But the content from that event was never systematically amplified. The digital extension never happened. The stories told in that room never reached the broader audience that would have moved the brand metric it was supposed to serve. The activation was exceptional, but without the strategic scaffolding around it, the plan to scale the content, extend the reach, and connect it to a measurable objective means it didn't do its job. The event remained a moment, not a movement, be it in scale or brand sentiment. Et voila, 6 elements, each with a specific purpose, each capable of either anchoring insight or letting it disappear into the activity list. That is the architecture. Now, I want to make one distinction before we move on, because this is the thing that trips people up most often. There is a difference between a plan that is insight-informed and a plan that is insight-led. Insight-informed means the research was done. The findings were referenced. Somewhere in the plan, there's data on the consumer. Okay? Insight-led means the insight actually changed a decision. It changed which problem was named, which objective was set, which trade-off was made, and what we don't like to talk about, essentially, which is which activity was also declined. That is a fundamentally different kind of plan. Luxury organizations in particular tend to have strong research and very strong execution instincts. Both are real and need to be there, but insight-led is the third piece. It's when those two things are connected by a visible, traceable thread of evidence. Evidence being the key word here. When what you know about the consumer clearly shapes what you decide to do. And just to be clear, this episode isn't trying to explain everything that drives marketing success or marketing 101. The quality of the strategy, the execution in the marketplace, the strength of the brand, those all matter enormously, of course, to success. But what we're focusing on today is something much more specific, how you communicate your thinking as a marketer, responsible for the brand plan inside the organization so that good strategic work actually gets recognized, understood, and approved. So remember at the beginning of the episode, I promised you that I would show you in just a couple of minutes how you can quickly check to see if your plan is actually strategic. Well, we can do that by asking ourselves 2 key questions. These will tell you very quickly whether your plan is actually strategic. Here they are. The first question, can I trace every objective in this plan back to a specific insight? Not a general industry trend, not a category assumption, a specific piece of understanding about the consumer, the market, or the brand. The second, does the plan clearly prioritize in order with clear metrics that define what success looks like? In other words, is it obvious what the team is focusing on this year and what will matter most if the plan succeeds? Because strategy always involves choice, and when insight genuinely shapes those choices, the plan becomes far easier for leadership to understand, support, and invest in. And that is when something interesting happens. the conversation stops sounding like marketing opinion and starts sounding like strategic judgment. Now, the natural next question is usually, okay, sure, I get it, but how? How do you actually build a problem statement leadership will accept? How do you set measurement before the year begins? How do you handle the strategic choices moment when the culture is all about activity in my organization? And this one's a really big one. These are exactly the kinds of questions I've been working on behind the scenes, developing a more structured way to go deeper into each of these elements and the thinking that sits behind them. Much of which comes from the training programs I developed inside some of the world's leading organizations working directly with marketers like you. I'll share more about this in the coming months, and if you'd like to be among the first to hear when it's ready, you can find a link to join our mailing list in the show notes or jump specifically to the waiting list for the course on the website. But for now, let's close the season properly. Season 1 of Lux Consumer IQ was about one thing, building the foundations of a more strategic practice based on evidence, insight, and data. Not theory for theory's sake, not frameworks in the abstract, but the specific practical thinking that makes the difference between being seen as someone who does good work and being seen as someone who shapes direction. We talked about data as credibility, insight as structured process, and brand health as infrastructure. And through our guest conversations, we heard directly from luxury insiders about how the most respected brands think about their consumer and what separates the ones who adapt from the ones who don't. And now the brand plan as the place where all of that thinking finally has to land. If you've followed this season from the beginning, I want you to take a moment and ask yourself something. What has shifted? Not in theory, but in how you're approaching your work, the questions you're asking, the way you're framing your thinking to your team or to leadership. Because that's where capability really lives, not in a certificate and not in a framework on a slide, in how you think, in what you notice, and in what you choose to do next. And of course, in this business, it's also in the stories you tell, the ones you tell internally to gain influence and bring your ideas to life, and the ones that help you understand and connect with your consumers. That is what this season has been building toward. And it's been a privilege to build it with you. So what's coming up next? Well, season 2 is where we go deeper, more insiders, more real-world strategic practice. And we'll even spotlight more specifically on global thought leaderships in this space. And to kick us off, we will start with a serious conversation about what AI is changing inside insight-led marketing and what that means for the professionals working in that space. We'll be back very soon. Thank you for being part of season 1. See you next time.